Hello. I'd like to take a look at the phrase, what is meant by a sore loser? Well, in my opinion, a sore loser in a sense is someone who's upset by the way things have turned out in life. Whether, for starters, it's a game, but in the larger sense, the game of life, such that as we may accumulate failure upon failure, or not get quite where we want in life, especially compared to others we see around us, then some of us, I suppose, will get quite bitter, and hence the phrase, he's a sore loser. In other words, someone perhaps keeps failing much more than he wishes, or can't seem to learn learn from his experiences, whereas some others can. And hence to the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. If we can't achieve what our neighbors do, or those we see on the TV screen or in the movies, we may get bitter at times and say, of such people, they're sore losers. But then, where does this bitterness come from? In my mind, it comes largely from expectations that are unmet. In other words, from Dollard's theory in the 1930s, perhaps, the psychologist saying that frustrated goals result in anger. But then why are some people's goals so often unrealistic and getting frustrated, or they don't have the tools to accomplish the same goals that others set and do accomplish so regularly? Where then is the factor, what are the factors that prevent some people from accomplishing much of any goals and coming up short, failing all the time, never really learning from their mistakes, and getting bitter and thus being sore losers? Hence the phrase, so-and-so is a sore loser. It strikes me that we start off in life thinking in a rather childish, narcissistic manner that we can accomplish anything we set our mind on and desire. But this is rather a childish notion, and while some can do it better than others, there are reasons for this. And as I've had it explained by some to me and thought on it, it mostly has to do with the number and type of resources we're given or not given in life to start out with, whereby simply wanting something doesn't make it happen unless you have the resources to apply to it, to make it happen. For, let's say, you want to create a loaf of bread or bake a cake or cook a dinner of any sort. Willpower alone, so to speak, is not going to make that happen, is it? Unless you have the ingredients. And the ingredients to accomplishing any goal, in part being resources. A variety of resources. But we're not taught this typically when we're urged to set goals, to get the resources in place first, are we? Because it's a rather, quote, unfair thing, obviously, that some get more resources than others in life. Hence the phrase, so-and-so was born with the short end of the stick. The short end of the stick regarding not getting many resources, or the ones we get not being the most important ones or enough. Consider, too, that if a person bakes a loaf of bread, it won't turn out properly unless you have all the ingredients, particularly the yeast. Otherwise, you come out with what the Bible says is unleavened bread, which may or not be suitable, and may or not be an optimal way of living life in general. That if you don't have all the resources necessary, you may not catapult to the strategies, to the to the utmost in life. And here's the problem then. In particular, a sore loser in my mind is a person who doesn't recognize this fact, that achievement and goal attainment is largely, if not completely, a matter of the resources you have or don't have. And the problem is setting goals if we don't have the resources, but we think we do. We tend to think all too often that everybody gets the same resources in life, but it is not certainly the case. Many people, for instance, don't realize that genetics plays a significant role, that your genetics can be good genetics, bad genetics, or of various sorts mixed, and that these are resources or lack of them. Additional resources we may get or not get come in childhood. Some are so-called child abuse, and thus deficit in certain requisite resources that provide low levels of anger, low levels of anxiety, and the ability to stick to task in general, and low levels of fear of such trauma occurring again, which could consume the rest of our lives with focusing on how to make things not happen again instead of how to make things happen. A fear orientation instead of a growth orientation. It all depending on our resources. But it's one thing to accept what happened and have few resources to live life, and it's quite another thing to think we got the same resources when we didn't. To not realize, for instance, that some people had much better childhoods than we did if we were so-called abused. And then to form the same goals that the non-abused people form. This then results in our setting goals that are quite too inappropriate, far beyond our means resources-wise. We keep failing, but we see others succeed sometimes and we get bitter. We form comparisonitis assessments, get bitter again, and hence the phrase sore loser. Now, I believe that not recognizing one's lack of resources in certain cases can get us in quite a number of scrapes. For instance, consider how so many people in our society in particular are taught by parents and other influencers to fight back, no matter who the opponent is. This is even taught by the Christian's Bible, where there's the story David versus Goliath. In the Bible, the story happens to turn out well for David, a man with supposedly few resources fighting a man with great resources. But in fact, how could David have ever won if his resources were in fact inferior to the task? Which is something to ponder. Maybe David was not quite the small man that is supposed. Maybe his pebble in his slingshot was not that small a pebble. I suppose in the biblical perspective, the pebble was guided by the hand of God. And so it wasn't any ordinary slingshot, and thus David had special resources that we're not really examining here. And that it wasn't a matter of luck that he struck Goliath and killed Goliath. But at any rate, that David's success was a matter of having the right resources to kill a supposed giant. Now, some other resources some get and others don't is with regard to love. Some are highly loved, some are the opposite of loved. Some get hostility, non-acceptance, physical and sexual violence. Others have very stable childhoods and others don't. Myself, for instance, I moved 10 times to a variety of locations in various states by the time I graduated from high school. I was never able really thus to form friendships that lasted, for that reason alone, amongst other factors. And so, that can be a factor. Whereas, on the other hand, a cousin of mine lived in perhaps only 2 locations up until the time of graduation from high school. And that second location started off at age 5 and lasted till 18 years of age. So that being a resource he had that I never got. Other resources some receive that others don't has to do with whether they were born in an urban setting or a country setting. Some of the greatest leaders we've ever had in societies throughout the ages came from rural environments, to include Gandhi and Lincoln. They had the unchaotic environment and plenty of time on hand to think without their thoughts being disturbed all the time by violence all around them and too many distractors. They were able to take life at a slower pace, and thus develop their philosophies of life and feel safer in general. Thus, a resource some get and some don't. Of course, there's also matters of safety. Some grow up in neighborhoods that are much safer than others. For instance, I once moved to a neighborhood at age 10 or 12, and in the first day, a neighbor boy my age offered his friendship hand to me, so to speak, by asking me if I wanted to go for a bike ride with him. I accepted, and we rode down the road, 2 bicyclists, and a few blocks later he suddenly accelerated, disappeared into the horizon, left me in the dust, and I had no idea where I was at and how to get home. Now, this is an example of an environment that some people don't face. That was rather an unstable and frightening environment. Other environments include, for instance, another location I lived in where there were apartment buildings, mega apartment buildings everywhere, with people who were often of questionable character as children because their parents were so too, associated often with apartment living because of low income status, and that in turn reflecting oftentimes instability of various sorts. So at any rate, additional factors include how much money a parent has, whereby this sometimes offering more stability again and better schooling, and not just in terms of better teachers and better programs and more offerings, but fewer bullies in the schools too, or better management of the children in general, such that any bullying going on is more in control, less tolerated, and the whole understanding of the staff being better. Other factors include the resources of your parents' world outlook, their religion, their premises of how they reason in general. For instance, consider if you were born in India to parents who were Jainists, of the Jainist religion, whereby they believe you must wear a face mask to prevent breathing in insects, because they deemed an insect's life as important as a human's life. Under such conditions, this could be quite a limiting religion based on limiting premises. And indeed, if you would look across the panoply of religions, all 4,000 some in the world today, I would maintain some have premises or moral codes that are toxic compared to others. Some codes urge hatred and violence, non-acceptance in general, whereas others are much more tolerant, more loving. Some, too, are based on free will and some determinism. And so, at any rate, all of these being a variety of resources accorded a child as he grows up. Now, the child doesn't realize this. The child thinks everybody's religion is equally valid and equally functional to their best purposes in life. Likewise, a child typically doesn't realize that if they are being, quote, abused, not all children are. Indeed, children who have had a tough time in this respect in life typically have so few friends that they don't know that anyone else has it better than they do. So again, then, a child can grow up and become an adult and form goals that are inappropriate to the resources they have, not realizing that others may have gotten better resources. And so when they compare the outcome as time goes on, in the veritable phrase, keeping up with the Jones, and they come up short, they'll get bitter, compare themselves inappropriately because they assume they have the same resources others got when it isn't true. And the end result being the phrase that they're sore losers. They're bitter, they have a chip on their shoulder, so to speak, because life shortchanged them, so to speak, but they don't know that some were not so shortchanged and that they shouldn't beat themselves over the head about it, that they should accept it more and do the best they can to overcome the resources they didn't get in childhood. Now, unfortunately, I rather see this playing out in the lives of those who got few resources in general to accomplish needed goals, including overall happiness and safety in life. The problem being that if you can't accomplish the basic needs in life for survive and be somewhat happy and somewhat safe, that we all too often, I think, turn to wishful thinking to accomplish goals that are in fact impossible. Wishful goals for finances, for happiness, for mates, anything and everything, in fact, can be turned into wishful thinking if reality is impossible because we didn't get some basic resources that some did get and that are necessary for life. We don't realize, in a sense, that the deck is stacked for some, and that for others they do get the short end of the stick as far as resources. We then tend to turn perhaps to a religion that is oriented toward free will, because it may tell us that anything is possible. Hence the phrase we've all heard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, if you're in a bad situation. But the problem with that being that, in my mind, this is equivalent to wishful thinking, trying to make something happen, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps when you don't have the resources. In other words, in a humorous sense, kind of like urging someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but then denying that they don't even have bootstraps to do it with. So, if you don't have the resource necessary to pull yourself up, how can you possibly pull yourself up? Another cute phrase, in a way, one I grew up believing in, and a friend of mine too, is, where there's a will, there's a way. In other words, a will for a certain goal happening, but without the resources, how can it happen? But in wishful thinking fashion, to make life more bearable, I used to think, Where there's a will, there's a way. That if you want something bad enough, you can have it, regardless of whether you have the resources or can get them. Now, granted, if you try hard enough to get resources, that's better than not trying to get resources. But still, sometimes there are limitations on getting of these resources. And you may get some of them, and some of them you may not get. A third factor, a third phrase that I think is rather incorrect is the phrase of willpower. That you can accomplish anything if you apply yourself with willpower. Again, a form of wishful thinking, that simply by willing something you can will resources into existence. Well, this may help you seek resources, but it doesn't, in my mind, make them appear out of blue air, out of thin air. Some of these resources can never be given us. Can never be acquired even, no matter how hard we try. I would thus say one last thing, and as this applies to bullying in childhood and other matters in adulthood, are being urged then oftentimes to fight back if we're bullied as children. But the issue then is whether this is wise or not. For consider two factors that I've been thinking of. I watched a video several months ago about a child who was bullied, for instance, and his answer to stopping it was to challenge the much larger child doing the bullying to a fight the next day, whereupon he did in fact fight the next day and lost the fight. But the outcome, quite surprisingly, is that a day after the fight was lost, the bully came around and put his arm around the loser of the fight and said, "I sure do respect your courage for having fought me, and basically despite your size and knowing you would probably lose." So this could, in certain circumstances, be a reason to fight a bullier. On the other hand, if there are too many of them at the same time, or they're too malicious, or this could turn sour. And also in today's day and age, the person who fights the bullier could end up in detention hall or juvenile hall, could actually be prosecuted. There are even instances where someone fighting a bullier went to excess, caused them physical harm, and were sued or otherwise severely punished. It working against them then to fight back a bully against bullies. But the concept being very interesting that fighting a bullier can ironically sometimes win their respect. For I was viewing a show on a book Wayne Dyer once wrote, Pulling Your Own Strings, and he said nobody respects a weak person. So, in essence, someone oppressing us, someone bullying us, someone being unfair to us, may actually change their tune somewhat if they start respecting us more if we fight back, even if we lose. But in my opinion, this happens much more on the childhood level, when only getting a broken bone or a bloody nose or a broken nose is involved. The losses are much more constrained and small. Whereas in an adult, if we were to fight the adult bulliers, so to speak, the people we call oppressors sometimes in our lives, we might not just get a bloody nose, but in fact end up in prison and spend a long time there and come out with a prison record and never be able to get a job again and be on welfare or disability and have bad housing, etc., etc. And so fighting the adult bully may get you in a lot of non-optimal situations. And the chances are they may not be influenced by our fighting them with respect to their being impressed by our courage, because what in my mind drives many an oppressor or an adult bully is not just the ego satisfaction they have, but money, control, power. And people of this sort are not necessarily impressed by how much courage you show, or on the other hand, whether you look like a wimp, so to speak, because you give way to your fears. If what they want is their money and power, etc., they're going to do what they have to get it, and they won't care much about how courageously you may fight or not fight. Hence the phrase, you can't fight City Hall. In other words, if City Hall wants its own way, it is not going to be very impressed by how much courage we may have trying to fight them. That is not going to influence how they regard us and what they want. If what they want is money or control, they're not going to be impressed by our attitude. They'll simply do what it takes for them to win. And if they have more resources, they will win. And if we have more resources, we will win. This, of course, applies too to a man like Hitler, whereby Hitler wanted what he wanted, and anyone who opposed him was not going to be regarded more highly by Hitler on the basis of having courage to fight him and perhaps die in his concentration camps. When Hitler wanted what he wanted, he could care less about anyone else's personality, their courage, etc., which then is a completely different matter than the playground as children. When children really didn't fight for money or power, but for ego needs. And so, to summarize one more time, I would say, in my view of things, the phrase, he's a sore loser, or so-and-so has a chip on their shoulder, is the type of person who has repeatedly set goals in life that they thought they could achieve because they thought they had the same resources everyone else did. And so their goals were overinflated, unrealistic, and they kept failing. And they couldn't modify their goals for certain reasons, particularly because they thought that their resources accorded them were the same as everyone else's. I hope this is good food for thought, at least, if not quite helpful, and I wish you a good day.